I didn't plan for it to happen that night. If I'm being honest, I didn't even plan on going. It started earlier that afternoon, in the most ordinary way. I was outside, pretending to straighten up the front yard, mostly just to get some air. That's when I saw him. My neighbor. We'd exchanged polite hellos for years, nothing more than small talk, smiles that lingered half a second too long, moments that never crossed a line. Until that day. He walked over like he always did, casual, relaxed, like there wasn't something different in his eyes. We talked about nothing at first. The weather, the neighborhood. Then there was a pause. A strange one. The kind that feels heavy, like the air shifts. He said there was a party later that night. He didn't call it what it was right away. He just said it was different. Adults only. A place where people went to be honest with themselves. He laughed softly after he said it, like he was testing how I'd react. I should have brushed it off. I should have laughed and gone back inside. But instead, I asked a question I didn't expect to ask. What kind of party? He looked at me for a moment before answering. Not rushing, not nervous, just watching me. And when he finally said the word, my stomach tightened. Swingers. I remember feeling embarrassed immediately, like he could see every thought running through my head. I told him I'd never been to anything like that it wasn't really me. He didn't pressure me. That was the part that stayed with me. He just said, "You don't have to do anything. You don't even have to stay. Just come see." After he left, I went inside and stood in my kitchen longer than I'd like to admit, doing nothing, thinking about everything. About how long it had been since I felt wanted. About how predictable my life had become. About how safe I always played it. And somehow, by the time the sun went down, I found myself getting dressed. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just something that made me feel seen. When he knocked on my door, my heart was already racing. We drove together, mostly in silence, the kind that hums instead of feels awkward. When we arrived, the house looked normal. Too normal. Soft lights, music low enough that it felt intentional. Before we went inside, he turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You're in control the entire time." I nodded, even though my hands were shaking. Inside, the atmosphere wasn't wild. It was calm, intimate. People talking, laughing, couples leaning into each other. The kind of environment where nothing is rushed, but everything feels charged. I stayed close to him at first, not because he asked, because I wanted to. And as the night went on, I started to realize something unsettling. No one was looking at me the way I expected. They weren't staring. They weren't judging. They were noticing. And my neighbor, he was watching me notice that. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the party. This was about the moment I stopped pretending I didn't feel anything anymore. And standing there, with the music low and the lights warm, I understood something else, too. Once you cross a certain line inside your own mind, going back isn't as simple as walking out the door.
At some point, someone offered me a drink. I took it more for something to do with my hands than because I wanted it. I remember how aware I was of everything, where I stood, how close people were, the way conversations flowed easily, without the usual guardrails. My neighbor stayed beside me, not possessive, not distant either, just present. Like he understood this wasn't about leading me anywhere. It was about letting me arrive on my own. We talked to another couple for a while,
Nothing shocking, nothing graphic, just easy conversation that drifted in subtle directions about marriage, about routines, about how people change over time. I noticed how often the women laughed, how relaxed everyone seemed. That unsettled me more than anything else. I'd expected chaos. I'd expected something reckless. Instead, it felt intentional. At one point, my neighbor leaned in slightly, close enough that only I could hear him. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, and I meant it. But my body told a more complicated story. I felt warm, awake, like parts of me that had been quiet for years were slowly remembering how to respond. We moved through the house, room by room, not rushing, observing. I noticed how some doors were closed, others opened just enough to suggest privacy without secrecy. People came and went, exchanging looks that seemed to say more than words ever could. Then something small happened. So small I almost missed it. My neighbor reached for my hand. Not tightly, not urgently, just enough to ask a question without asking it out loud. I didn't pull away. That choice echoed louder in my mind than the music playing softly in the background. We didn't go anywhere private. Not then. We just stood there, hands lightly touching, talking to someone else as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because once you allow that closeness, once you let yourself be seen without correcting it, it changes how you breathe, how you listen, how you imagine the rest of the night unfolding. I remember realizing something that made my chest tighten. I wasn't thinking about my husband. Not in that moment. I wasn't thinking about consequences or explanations or tomorrow morning. I was thinking about how present I felt, how long it had been since I'd felt like a choice instead of an obligation. And as the evening deepened, I started to understand what my neighbor meant earlier. I was in control. But control doesn't always mean stopping. Sometimes, it means deciding how far you're willing to go once you've already stepped inside. And that was the thought that followed me as we moved toward the back of the house, quietly, deliberately, without saying where we were going. We didn't speak as we moved. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything would have made it real too fast. The hallway felt quieter than the rest of the house. The music faded just enough to remind me how aware I was of every step, every breath. I could feel my pulse in places I hadn't noticed in years, like my body was gently reminding me it was still capable of reacting. We stopped near a doorway that wasn't fully closed. He didn't reach for me again. He didn't guide me inside. He just waited. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about him at all. It was about whether I would choose to keep going when no one was pushing me forward. I glanced back once, toward the brighter rooms behind us, toward the laughter, toward the version of myself that still could have decided this was all just curiosity. Then I looked at him. He searched my face, not for permission, but for certainty. "I can take you home," he said quietly. "Right now." I believed him. That made the decision heavier. I stepped closer instead. Not into the room, not into his arms, just closer. Close enough that the space between us felt deliberate. That's when I realized how calm I felt. Not reckless, not out of control, just awake. Like something dormant had finally been acknowledged. Nothing happened right away, and somehow that made it more intense, because anticipation has a way of stretching time, turning seconds into something that feels meaningful, charged, dangerous in the quietest way. I became aware then of how much I had been denying myself, not desire, but presence. The simple act of being fully there, without rushing to explain or justify. He leaned in slightly, his voice low. Are you sure? I nodded, and with that small movement, I felt a line shift inside me. Not crossed, just relocated. Whatever followed after that wouldn't be something I stumbled into. It would be something I chose. And standing there, in that dim hallway, with the night still unfolding around us, I understood something that made my chest tighten. The hardest part wasn't going further. The hardest part was knowing that once I did, there would be no pretending this was just a story I told myself to feel alive.
I don't remember who moved first, only that the space between us changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that I became aware of how quiet everything had become, how the world seemed to narrow to the sound of our breathing, slow and measured. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. We talked for a moment longer, voices low, about nothing important, about how strange the night felt, about how unexpected it was to end up here at all. The words didn't matter as much as the pauses between them. Time stretched. I became aware of how deliberate every second felt, how choosing not to act was just as much a choice as acting, how restraint could be as loud as intention. Eventually, we stepped back, together, not because something ended, but because something had settled. We returned to the main room, to the music and the low conversations, carrying with us an understanding that didn't need to be spoken. I stayed near him, not clinging, just aligned, like two people who now shared a quiet awareness neither of us had before. When it was time to leave, I didn't hesitate. The drive home was different from the drive there. Still quiet, but heavier, charged with thoughts that didn't need words. At a stoplight, he glanced over at me, as if to check something. I met his eyes and smiled, small, knowing. At my house, he walked me to the door. We stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the night cool, the air still. Thank you for trusting me, he said. I nodded. Thank you for not asking me to. He left then, without trying to turn the moment into anything else. Inside, the house felt the same, and completely different. I stood there in the quiet, aware of a shift that couldn't be undone, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. That night, lying awake, I realized something that stayed with me long after. I hadn't gone to that party to escape my life. I'd gone to remember that I still had choices. And once you remember that, everything that follows carries a different kind of weight. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not because nothing changed, but because everything did, just beneath the surface. I went back to my routines. Morning coffee, small conversations, familiar spaces. On the outside, it looked exactly the same. Anyone watching would have assumed the night had passed without consequence. But I carried it with me. Not the party, not the people, the awareness. I noticed how often my thoughts drifted now, how moments that once felt flat suddenly held weight, how silence no longer felt empty, but full of things I hadn't said yet. I saw my neighbor a few days later, across the street, brief, casual. Our eyes met, and there was no awkwardness, no guilt, just a quiet understanding that didn't ask to be explained. He nodded once. I returned it. Nothing more. And somehow, that felt heavier than anything else. At home, my husband asked if I wanted to do something that weekend. His voice was familiar, comfortable, predictable. I said maybe. I meant it. That night, lying awake,
I realized something that unsettled me more than the party ever could. Nothing had happened, and yet I wasn't the same. Because once you see yourself as someone capable of choosing differently, once you feel that door open inside you, it doesn't slam shut just because you walk away. It stays there, waiting. And I couldn't stop wondering whether the hardest part was resisting temptation or living with the knowledge that, when the moment came, I hadn't needed to be convinced at all. Weeks passed, long enough that the memory should have softened, long enough that the night should have folded itself neatly into the past. It didn't. Instead, it changed shape. I found myself thinking about it in fragments. The tone of the music, the way the rooms were arranged, the calm certainty in my neighbor's voice when he said I was in control. None of it dramatic, none of it loud, just deliberate. My husband and I fell back into our patterns. Conversations about errands, about work, about things that mattered just enough to fill the space between us. He didn't notice anything different about me. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not guilt, not fear. Invisibility. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw my neighbor again. He was outside, same place as always. But this time we didn't pretend we were strangers sharing a sidewalk. He walked over slowly. "Hey," he said. "Hey." That was it at first. We talked about the neighborhood, about how quiet it had been, about nothing that needed to be remembered. And yet, the silence between our words felt intentional. Like we both understood there were things we weren't saying, because saying them would change the balance. "I just wanted to check in," he said eventually. "Make sure you were all right." I nodded. "I am." I was telling the truth, but there was more to it than that. He looked at me for a moment, then smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for anything. The kind that acknowledges something already exists. "If you ever want to talk," he said, "you know where to find me." Then he stepped back. No pressure, no invitation disguised as concern. Just space. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and felt the contrast more sharply than ever between being safe and being seen. Nothing had happened, and yet something had begun. Because once you allow yourself to recognize a possibility, it doesn't disappear just because you choose not to act on it. It waits, patient, quiet, for the moment you finally stop asking whether you should and start asking whether you already have. It was that question that followed me everywhere. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to stay present. I noticed it in small moments, standing at the sink, watching water run longer than it needed to, sitting across from my husband while he talked about his day, realizing I was listening out of habit, not curiosity. The distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had just become harder to ignore. A few nights later, I found myself outside again, the air cool, the street quiet. I told myself I needed space, fresh air, silence. That's when I saw him. He was watering his lawn, unhurried, like the evening belonged to him. When he noticed me, he turned off the hose and smiled. No surprise, no calculation. We stood there, a few steps apart, talking about ordinary things. The weather shifting, a neighbor moving out. Small talk that carried just enough weight to keep us there longer than necessary. I didn't mean to complicate things, he said at one point, gently. You didn't, I replied, and I meant it. Because the complication hadn't come from him. It had come from the part of me that finally felt awake and didn't want to pretend otherwise. There was a pause then, the kind that asks a question without words. I won't cross any lines, he said. Not unless you tell me where they are. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Because it wasn't a promise. It was an invitation to define something I'd avoided defining for a long time. I don't know where they are anymore, I admitted. He nodded, understanding without needing more. We didn't move closer. We didn't need to. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough to change the shape of a moment. As I turned to go back inside, I felt something shift again. Not forward, not backward. Sideways. Like the world had opened a door I wasn't required to walk through, but couldn't forget existed. That night, lying awake, I realized the truth I'd been circling around. The party hadn't been the beginning. It had been the reminder. And whatever followed next wouldn't arrive loudly or suddenly. It would arrive quietly. The moment I decided whether being comfortable was enough, or whether being honest with myself mattered more. After that night, I became more careful. Not with my actions, with my thoughts. I noticed how often I replayed conversations in my head. Not what was said, but what wasn't. The pauses, the looks, the way certain moments lingered longer than they should have. I didn't see him every day. Sometimes a week would pass without a word. And somehow, that made it harder. The space left room for imagination, for questions that didn't need answers yet. At home, things continued as they always had. My husband sat beside me on the couch, familiar and distant in a way I'd never named before. We shared meals. We shared space. We shared history. But presence, that was something else. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, he mentioned how quiet I'd been lately. He said it casually, without accusation. I told him I was just tired. He accepted that explanation easily. That should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me. Because I realized how little it took for things to remain exactly the same. How easy it was to stay inside a version of life that asked nothing new of me. A few days later, I received a message. Just one line. Hope you're doing well. No follow-up. No expectation. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because it wasn't the message that mattered. It was the fact that he knew when to stop. I replied hours later. Short, polite, safe. And yet, even that felt like a step. As the weeks went on, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing irreversible. But the ground beneath me had shifted. Because once you allow yourself to be seen, even briefly, it becomes harder to accept being invisible. And the most dangerous part wasn't temptation. It was awareness. The kind that doesn't push you forward, but makes standing still feel impossible. I started noticing the moments when I felt most awake. They weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. They were quiet stretches of time where I caught myself thinking instead of reacting, where I realized how much of my life had been lived on autopilot. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in the living room, the house unusually still, when that thought returned again. Nothing has happened, and yet, everything feels different. I thought about how easy it would be to pretend that night never mattered, to tell myself it was just curiosity.
just a moment that passed. People do that all the time. They smooth things over, tuck them away, move on. But I couldn't unfeel what I'd felt. Not desire exactly. Clarity. The clarity that comes when you realize you've been settling, not for lack of options, but because it felt simpler. Later that week, I ran into my neighbor again. Brief. Accidental. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. We exchanged a few words, nothing personal, nothing that would raise questions. But before we parted, he said something quietly. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't deciding what to do," he said. "It's admitting what you already know." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to. That night, lying beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling longer than usual. I listened to the familiar sounds of the house, the ones that once made me feel safe, and now made me feel contained. I realized then that the party, the neighbor, the conversations, they weren't the story. They were the catalyst. The story was the moment I finally stopped telling myself I was fine with everything staying exactly the same. Because once that thought takes root, it doesn't rush you. It doesn't demand action. It just waits, patiently, for the moment you decide whether you're willing to keep living a life that feels acceptable, or whether you're ready to risk something more honest. And I knew, deep down, that moment was coming. I just didn't know yet what I would do when it finally arrived. It arrived sooner than I expected. Not as a confrontation, not as a dramatic turning point, as a question. My husband asked me one night, almost absent-mindedly, if I was happy. He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed on the television, like the answer didn't really matter as long as it didn't disrupt anything. "Yes," I said. The word came out automatically. And in that moment, I understood something that made my chest tighten. I hadn't lied to him, but I hadn't told the truth either. After he fell asleep, I stayed awake, staring into the dark, replaying that single word in my head. Happy. It felt smaller than it used to, narrower, like a label I'd outgrown without realizing it. The next day, I found myself thinking about my neighbor again. Not in a specific way, not replaying moments or imagining outcomes, just aware of the space he occupied in my thoughts, quietly, without effort. That awareness felt dangerous, not because of what it might lead to, but because of what it already revealed. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside. The air was warm, the street quiet. He was there, working on something in his driveway. When he saw me, he straightened and smiled. We didn't rush toward each other. We didn't pretend not to see one another. We met in the middle, casually, like neighbors do. "How have you been?" he asked. I considered giving the easy answer. Instead, I said, "Thinking." He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. We stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable but charged in a way that felt familiar now. Not heavy, not urgent. Honest. "I don't want to complicate your life," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "But if it already feels complicated," he continued, "maybe that's worth paying attention to." That was all. No invitation, no pressure. Just a truth placed gently between us. As I walked back inside, I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. This wasn't about choosing between two people. It was about choosing whether I was willing to keep ignoring the part of myself that had finally started speaking. And I knew, with a certainty that both frightened and steadied me, that I was running out of ways to pretend I hadn't heard it. Whatever came next wouldn't announce itself. It would arrive quietly,
The moment I stopped saying, "I'm fine," and started asking myself what I actually wanted. I didn't make any decisions that night. I didn't confess anything. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What I did was something quieter. I stopped pretending that not choosing was the same as being content. In the days that followed, life continued exactly as it always had. Meals, conversations, familiar routines that required very little from me. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had shifted. Because once you recognize a truth about yourself, you don't get to unknow it. You can delay it. You can soften it. You can bury it under responsibility and habit. But it waits. I still see my neighbor from time to time. Our conversations stay brief, respectful, unremarkable to anyone watching. And that's how it needs to be. For now. My husband still asks how my day was, still assumes my answers mean what they always have. I let him, not out of cruelty, but because I'm still listening to myself, trying to understand what honesty actually requires. The party feels distant now, almost unreal, but the awareness it sparked hasn't faded. Because the most dangerous thing isn't temptation, it's clarity. And I know this much for certain. Nothing has happened yet. But something will. Not because I'm reckless, not because I'm unhappy, but because once you realize you've been living on autopilot, eventually you have to decide whether you're willing to keep doing it, or whether you're ready to take control of your own life. And when that moment comes, it won't look dramatic. It will look like an ordinary day, where I finally stop telling myself I'm fine, and choose what comes next.